Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, I'm going to read you the first chapter from my upcoming book, Babies Are Not Pizzas. They're Born, Not Delivered. Hi, everyone. We are planning on releasing the new book, Babies Are Not Pizzas, next week. And to get everyone ready for that exciting event, I wanted to share with you the first chapter from the book. Over the past month, I've been spending time at Dynamix Productions, which is an audio producing studio in my hometown. And I've been working on recording the book so that we can upload it to Audible shortly after the paperback is released. I'm really happy with the quality of the audio and the production that Neil, the owner of Dynamix Productions, is putting behind this book. Everybody told me that I should read the book myself because they said that a memoir just sounds better and reads better when it's read by the author themselves. So in a minute, I'm going to be reading you chapter 1. But before I do that, I want to give you a little heads up as to what you can expect next week when Babies Are Not Pizzas is officially released. The book will be available on Amazon both as a printed book and a Kindle book or digital book. We will also be putting it on other platforms, and as it becomes available on other platforms, we'll let you know. The Audible version will come out sometime after the print and Kindle versions come out. The book will be published in English, but through 2019 and 2020, we will be accepting proposals for publication and translation in other countries other than the United States. But everybody should be able to get the English language version from Amazon. We will also have bulk copies available at the Evidence-Based Birth shop online. We know so many of our audience members are just waiting for this book to come out so that they can get their own copy. I wanted to let you know that we have something special in store for those of you who get your own copy, either digital or in print, in the first month after the book is released. We do not have a pre-order option at this time, so your first chance to order the book will be the day it comes out. Once it's available, if you order the book within the first month after it's released, we are going to give you a free companion to Babies Are Not Pizzas. The companion is a bundle of 5 PDFs of the first topics I tackled at Evidence-Based Birth, so printer-friendly, full-length PDFs. You'll get an invitation to a webinar about those 5 research topics, along with handouts that go with that webinar. You'll get digital files with birth affirmations that you can print off as postcards and take to a birth. And the biggest thing of all is that we are gifting everyone who purchases a physical or digital version of the book, we're gifting you the audio recording of the book. This is going to be a super high quality MP3 of the book. Like I said earlier, the book will also be available on Audible, but for everyone who purchases it within the first 30 days, if you submit your receipt to us, and we'll have a whole system set up for that. If you show us proof that you purchased the book, you will, in the first 30 days, you'll get this companion that includes the audio book. So you'll be sent a link to be able to download the audio. And the entire companion is completely free to those of you who order the book within the first 30 days. So I hope you're as excited as me about all of these awesome resources that we're going to give away for free alongside the book. And now I'm going to turn it over to the recording and you can get a sample. So we're going to read the whole first chapter from Babies Are Not Pizzas. Chapter 1, Naive. I went into my first birth with rose-colored glasses. I figured everything would be fine as long as I had a healthy pregnancy, which to me meant exercising and not gaining too much weight. I had seen a few births back in nursing school, and I didn't want to be one of those patients they gossiped about at the nurses' station. So one of my main goals for this birth was for the nurses to like me, especially because I was giving birth at the hospital affiliated with the university where I was finishing my PhD in nursing, the only place my student health insurance would permit me to give birth. I planned to listen to my healthcare providers and do as I was told. I didn't do too much preparation. I read several popular pregnancy books, which, in retrospect, weren't the best choices, like the one-day hospital childbirth class my husband Dan and I took. the book seemed to send the message that we should passively accept everything that would be done to us during our hospital stay. With only random bits of education, I was not prepared for what the system had in store for me. I laughed at birth plans. How can you possibly plan birth? You're supposed to be flexible. You should do what your doctor says. They're the one with the medical degree. My only true desire was to have a vaginal birth and maybe try to avoid pain medication for as long as possible because I am not a fan of needles. Looking back, I realize I placed total control of my birth into the hands of the professionals who would be taking care of me. What I didn't know then is that if you give up total control of your decisions and don't do any education or planning, you often end up getting the lowest quality of healthcare at the highest cost to yourself, your health, and your wallet. Although I was oblivious about what I was headed toward, my younger sister by 2.5 years, Shannon, was really worried for me. Shannon was training to be a doctor in Michigan at the time, and she was witnessing all kinds of concerning situations on the labor and delivery unit. She noticed how many women were receiving totally unnecessary interventions, like medications given to speed up labor even when labor was progressing normally, or episiotomies or cesareans being done because the physician was tired of waiting for the client to push the baby out. One time, a resident told Shannon, "Well, she's 4 centimeters now, so we are going to go break her water." "Why?" Shannon asked. Pause. "Because that's what we do." Feeling a bit like a 2-year-old, Shannon again asked, "Why?" "Because it will make it go faster." "Why do we need it to go faster?" The resident grew more annoyed and brushed Shannon off. A few hours later, after finding all the research articles she could on PubMed, Shannon came back to the resident. "So I was looking up this issue of rupturing membranes. It looks like it doesn't really make the first stage of labor go faster, and it can increase the risk of infection." As you can probably guess, my sister was not the best loved student on this rotation, but she did learn a lot about the culture of labor and delivery and the need for change. Years later, she also told me, "While training in obstetrics, I began to see that we, as doctors, can lie to our patients and lie to ourselves if we need to." Given what she was seeing in the clinical setting, Shannon worried for me, but she didn't tell me horror stories or preach at me or tell me what to do. I remember one time when we were on the phone, she asked some concerned questions about my childbirth preparation, but I brushed her off saying, "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." I really liked my OB. She was funny, nice, and smart. My husband and I both enjoyed our appointments with her, and she promised that she would be the one present at my birth. I didn't realize at the time how rare my situation was. What my OB offered at the time, and very few OBs practice today, is called continuity of care, when the caregiver at your birth is the person you've been seeing throughout pregnancy. These days, most physicians, out of practical necessity, rotate call, meaning they take turns going to the hospital when someone is in labor. My OB practiced continuity of care with me, and thus she was present at a birth that, in the hands of one of the other OBs in her practice, might have easily become a cesarean. I was 39 weeks and 3 days into my pregnancy in the fall of 2008. I had been totally healthy, with the exception of my migraine headaches, which had worsened during pregnancy. Dan and I had finished watching a movie when, just before 11 p.m., my water broke. I felt this little pop and a tiny gush of water like I'd just barely wet my pants. "I think my water just broke," I exclaimed. One of the instruction sheets we had been given said to go to the hospital if my water broke, so we started gathering our things. I took a quick shower and ate a big snack, knowing that I wouldn't be allowed to eat or shower once I got to the hospital. I was prepared to obey hospital policy without question. Remember, I wanted to be a good patient. During our quick 7-minute drive to the hospital, my contractions started. They were easy to handle and coming 5 minutes apart. Dan dropped me off at the hospital entrance, and I made my way to triage alone while he parked the car. Triage is sort of a hospital holding area for patients coming in for birth, not used in all facilities, where people in labor can be assessed before being admitted. In triage, I was put on a narrow stretcher in a room with another patient, separated only by a curtain. There, I was checked in by a nurse, physically examined, including my vagina, asked questions, the other patient could hear my answers, poked for an IV, and hooked up to monitors. During my time in triage, the OB resident took some fluid from my vagina, then hunched over a microscope with a medical student, examining the sample. "See that fern pattern on the slide? That's amniotic fluid," I remember her telling the excited medical student. "Wow," the student said breathlessly. After proving that my water had indeed broken, they signed the paperwork to admit me to the labor and delivery unit. The triage nurse put me in a wheelchair and wheeled me to L&D. She dropped me off inside the room and said, "You should go to the bathroom now, because you're not allowed to get out of bed from now on." I remember being struck by that command. It seemed odd that they didn't plan on letting me use the bathroom while I was in labor, but desiring to be a compliant patient, I padded my hospital-slippered feet to the bathroom, peed, and returned to the bed. There, I had an IV hooked up to a bag of fluids, a belt fitted tightly around my abdomen to measure my contractions, and another belt placed to measure my baby's heart rate. The belts had these hard, circular-shaped discs that pressed firmly and uncomfortably into my very pregnant abdomen. An hour later, I needed to pee again, and when I pushed the call light button, I was told that I must use a bedpan. Although I'd helped many patients use one in my career, I'd never personally urinated in a bedpan before. I tried, and cannot tell you how difficult it was to urinate lying flat on my back on that hard plastic pan while having contractions with two people watching me. I just could not go. So the nurse inserted a painful catheter tube into my urethra to empty my bladder, instead of letting me walk 10 feet to the bathroom. Just like that, I had transformed from a healthy pregnant woman to a patient in a hospital gown, lying on my back in a hospital bed. I was offered Pitocin, artificial oxytocin, a medication used to speed up contractions, but I politely declined. My contractions were already coming 5 minutes apart, so I didn't see the need. I was beginning to feel a little bit trapped, realizing that I was about to undergo labor without food, drink, movement, or permission to use the bathroom. By now, it was the middle of the night and I was left alone. I knew labor might take a while, so I had told Dan to try to sleep while he could. He slept in an armchair and I endured labor in bed, on my back, in the dark, with a random football game replaying on the TV and nobody there to support me. Suddenly, just before sunrise, everything changed. The OB residents, medical student, and attending obstetrician started taking turns rounding on me. I started getting more and more pressure to get Pitocin and an epidural. "Your labor's taking an abnormally long time," a resident explained to me around 7 a.m. My water had broken 8 hours earlier. I learned later that it's normal for a first-time mom to have a long, early phase of labor, especially if water broke before labor began. But I hadn't gotten past 2 centimeters yet, and they were not happy with my progress. I hadn't expected to get that kind of pressure. I kept saying, "No thank you, no thank you, no thank you," to almost everyone who entered the room. For someone who hadn't had much education about childbirth, I was pretty good at saying no to an unnecessary intervention. But in labor, under pressure, and with no way out except to have the baby, I couldn't say no forever. Around noon, I begrudgingly agreed to the Pitocin. They started with a low dose, and my labor picked up almost immediately. I had heard that Pitocin-induced contractions were more painful, so I asked for an epidural. The anesthesiology resident came in to do the procedure. He informed me of the medical benefits and risks of an epidural, and I signed the consent form. However, what happened next was somewhat traumatic. The resident tried once, twice, 3 times to get the huge needle in my back, but he claimed that because of my scoliosis, mild curve in my spine, and what he described as tiny bone structure, he couldn't get it in. Those 3 attempts were excruciatingly painful. Finally, the attending came in to take over and was able to get the epidural placed. Afterward, I shivered uncontrollably, dry heaved, and cried. I couldn't stop crying for a while. I don't know why. The epidural kicked in. In fact, the nerve block was so strong that I was completely numb from the waist down. I couldn't move my legs at all. Every time I wanted to shift my position, Dan had to move my body around for me. They didn't feel like my own limbs, they felt like elephant legs. It was a weird and uncomfortable sensation. This problem doesn't happen to everyone who gets an epidural, but too strong of a motor block is a potential side effect of epidurals that I happened to experience. I lay on my back and more time went by until all of a sudden I felt the urge to push. It felt like I had intense pressure in my bottom. By now, it was 7 p.m. I pushed the button on my call light and the nursing assistant poked her head in the door. Excitedly, I told her, "I think I'm ready to push." She said, "I'm so sorry. Everyone is in report. You'll just have to wait. We'll be back in half an hour or so." Frightened by the overwhelming pushing feelings, not knowing what to do, I pushed my epidural button repeatedly, delivering doses that numbed all sensations. About 30 minutes later, the medical student walked in, dressed from head to toe in bodily fluid protection gear, complete with a plastic face shield, like she was about to start welding or something. A half dozen people followed her. The staff coached me to push. They put my feet in stirrups and I lay on my back, half sitting up. I couldn't feel a single thing in the lower half of my body. The pushy feeling was gone due to my overzealous attempts to medicate it. The nurse said, "Now hold your breath and push. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This pushing effort went on for an hour, and I made 0 progress. I was too numb to push effectively, if at all. But then, after an hour, my epidural started to wear off. I started pushing with a renewed zeal, but after another hour, my baby's head still wasn't coming down. Then my OB did an exam and discovered that the baby's position was not optimal. Later, I found that this was not a surprising finding, given that I'd just spent nearly 24 hours in a back-lying position that didn't allow the baby space to move down and rotate the way she needed to. Researchers think that laboring upright and moving around uses gravity to help the baby's head descend into the pelvis in the optimal position for birth. My doctor asked my permission to maneuver the baby's head into a more favorable position, and I consented. Basically, she inserted her entire hand up my vagina and into my dilated cervix, put her hand on the baby's head, and rotated the baby around. Even though I was still partially numb from the epidural, the pain from this procedure was so intense that I leaned over the side of the bed and vomited. However, after she adjusted my baby's position, I finally started making some progress. It was now my 3rd hour of pushing, and I was exhausted, but the baby was coming out. At the very end, the OB asked my permission to use a vacuum suction cup device on my baby's head to help pull her out, called a vacuum-assisted delivery. And again, I consented. Finally, at 10:50 p.m., my daughter Clara was born after 24 hours of labor, including more than 3 hours of pushing. Clara was immediately removed from my sight so she could be suctioned, swaddled, measured, and weighed. As my OB attended to my needs, checking to see if I needed stitches or not, thankfully, I only needed 1 stitch. I thanked her. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you so much for never even mentioning the word C-section after all those hours." She said, "You're welcome. I knew you didn't want one. And if a woman can't birth a 6-pound, 8-ounce baby vaginally, there's something wrong with this world." The birth was done, but my baby was not in the room. Although her APGAR scores were normal, APGAR scores are a way of assessing the health of a baby at birth. After they let me take one photo holding her all bundled up, the hospital staff whisked her away to the nursery for observation. Now, this did not make sense. I had accepted without question so much of what the hospital told me to do. I'd fasted for 24 hours, used a bedpan, complied with all their requests and recommendations. But I would not, could not, accept separation from my baby, my own baby, who I had been growing inside my body for the last 9 months and was so eager to meet after a full day and night of labor. Still paralyzed from the waist down due to my epidural, I pushed my call light button every 10 or 15 minutes. "Where is my baby? When will they bring my baby to me? I need to breastfeed." 1 hour went by. 2 hours went by. At 2 hours, when I checked again to see if she was coming to me, I was told over the intercom, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. We just gave her a bath and her hair's all wet. We have to wait for her hair to dry." Finally, at around 1:30 a.m., nearly 3 hours after she'd been born, she was brought to me for the first breastfeed. She was sleepy. We'd missed the magical golden hour when freshly born babies are still wide awake after birth and ready to bond and breastfeed, and she didn't latch well. The night nurse didn't really know how to help me. She just stood by and watched while I clumsily tried to latch my drowsy baby onto my breast. It hurt. I found out later that since my nurse didn't know how to help me, I hadn't properly latched Clara, and as a result, these first attempts to breastfeed left my nipples cracked and damaged, which would haunt us in the days and weeks to come. The next morning, we were a hot mess. I had started labor Saturday evening, given birth on Sunday evening, and now it was Monday morning. Dan and I hadn't slept since Friday. Poor Dan went into the bathroom and started dry heaving from exhaustion. I was struggling with breastfeeding. It was so painful, and I could barely keep my eyes open. But napping was impossible with the number of hospital staff coming in and out of my hospital room. I sent Dan home so he could get some uninterrupted sleep. By that evening, I was desperate to rest, as it had been 72 hours since I'd closed my eyes. The night nurse offered to take my baby away so I could have some time to sleep. I agreed, but asked her not to give Clara any formula, as we were still working hard to establish breastfeeding. When the nurse brought her back a few hours later, I was disheartened to see that Clara was spitting up formula. After one more busy day of sleeplessness and constant visitors and staff coming in and out of my room, I was discharged the next afternoon. Looking back on what happened, some of my story might seem somewhat nightmarish, but part of you might be thinking that what I experienced wasn't that bad. I had a healthy baby, right? I gave birth vaginally and stayed in one piece. I didn't have major abdominal surgery like 1/3 of American women do when giving birth. I didn't even experience any major tears when the baby came out. Although the staff put pressure on me to follow certain policies and recommendations, they were always friendly and polite. So what was off about this situation, and why does it matter? Even today, it's hard for me to put my finger on it. But if I had to sum it up, I think there were quite a few wrong things that happened at my daughter's birth. First, my baby and I were treated like we were sick, even though we were healthy all along. Second, I was coerced to have specific interventions instead of being given true alternatives and then being supported in my choices. Third, you might have noticed that I was never offered any comfort measures or support from my nurses other than an epidural. No tub, no shower, no positioning, no massage, no ability to walk around, no breastfeeding support. Dan and I were left alone for most of our labor. I was in pain in a cold, clinical place with no idea of what was going to happen next. Fourth, I experienced a lot of pressure to receive unnecessary interventions that caused bad things to happen down the line. For example, I was made to lie on my back, which slowed down labor, increased my pain, and may have prevented my baby from getting into an optimal position for birth. That led to the use of Pitocin and an epidural, which led to a long pushing phase and a vacuum-assisted birth, and ultimately, hours of separation between me and my baby during the most important bonding time humans experience in their lifetimes. The domino effect of one intervention leading to another actually has a name among professionals in the childbirth field: the cascade of interventions. I tell this story of my first daughter's birth because I'm not alone. When I share this story with others, about half the time, the person I'm telling the story to starts crying. Why are they crying? Because they identify with my story. But why are they crying even if it's been years, sometimes decades after giving birth? Because what happens in birth stays with you the rest of your life. Those feelings never leave, especially the distress at being separated from your newborn. I always knew something was wrong with how tears welled in my eyes when I thought about my separation from Clara. But I never knew why. Why on earth would I cry when I remembered her birth, the day that should have been the most joyful of my life? It wasn't until years later when I met Dr. Cheryl Beck, a world-renowned researcher on birth trauma and postpartum mood disorders, and I shared my birth story with her, that I finally received the answer I was searching for. "Rebecca," she said, her eyes locked with mine, "that was birth trauma." Birth trauma is defined as a birth event with actual or threatened serious injury or death, or when the person giving birth feels they have been stripped of their dignity or treated inhumanely. Birth trauma is estimated to occur in 33% to 45% of all births in the U.S. and Australia. These numbers are astoundingly high and explain why it's so common to hear horror stories about childbirth from family and friends. Women who experience birth trauma often describe cold, unsupportive, or degrading and inhumane care. Their care providers don't communicate with them. They may talk over them as if they're not there. The woman may fear for their safety or that of their baby, especially if they're told they must comply so we can keep your baby safe. And in the end, their experience is almost never validated. Everyone tells them, "But you have a healthy baby." I was fortunate in that I did not develop any major psychological ramifications from my birth trauma. Some people who experience birth trauma will go on to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You're more likely to develop PTSD after a traumatic birth experience if you have a history of anxiety, depression, or trauma, or if you experienced medical complications such as cesarean or a postpartum hemorrhage. People who are survivors of sexual assault are at especially high risk for PTSD after birth trauma. This is because many abuse survivors are exposed to traumatic triggers during labor, such as during vaginal exams. On the opposite end of the spectrum from birth trauma, I learned that researchers have found that some people feel incredibly satisfied and empowered after giving birth. Some people, in fact, are so excited by their birth experiences that they make a career out of birth, going into nursing, midwifery, or doula work. Learning this fact, that some people felt empowered by giving birth, made me curious. What's the difference between a scary, traumatic birth and an empowering, satisfying one? Is it luck? Is it the presence or absence of complications? Or is it something else? The answer is surprisingly simple. In one review of 137 studies on birth satisfaction, researchers found that the factors that most influence birth satisfaction include whether or not your expectations were met, whether or not you felt involved in decision-making, and how you were treated by your care providers. I didn't have very high expectations for this birth. I wanted to get through it without having surgery, and I did, so in that respect, I was satisfied. I actually wrote in my journal a few weeks after, I'm so happy with our birth, and I wouldn't have had it go any other way. But I was still so blind. I didn't know how good birth could be. I didn't know what it was like to have a childbirth care team focused on empowering me while also helping keep me and my baby safe. If I had known in that moment what I was missing out on, I might have been even more traumatized. But as it was, I was still pretty naive. I did know, though, that my baby and I should have been given time to bond and get to know each other, that it was wrong for the staff to separate us. Why did they do that? Didn't they realize the harm they could cause? Why were they so flippant about keeping Clara away from me during the first hours of her life? Why did they think it wasn't a big deal? I didn't know the answers to all of these why questions. All I knew was that I left birth feeling exhausted and disempowered, and I started parenthood that way as well. So that's the end of chapter 1 of Babies Are Not Pizzas, and that chapter is entitled Naive. The next chapter is called Evidence. So there are a couple of turning points in this story. The first one, which you just listened to, is the turning point where I began to realize the next time I have a baby, I need to be able to get better evidence-based care. So in chapter 2, we focus a lot on the evidence. In chapter 3, I make a big discovery that helps me reach that first initial goal. But then at the end of chapter 3, there's another turning point where I realize that I actually have a different goal in mind. This is where I have a big change of plans. So I'm super excited to reveal the book and all its turning points and all the work that went into this book next week. Make sure you're subscribed at evidencebasedbirth.com/book to be among the first to know when the book is available. We will have both ebook and physical book copies available. And don't forget, we will also have that companion available along with the files to the audiobook for those of you who get the book in the first 30 days. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll be in touch next week when the book is ready. Thanks, everyone. Bye.